And welcome back to our reading of The Red Lion by Maria Schepers. Again, the song says, I'd love to change the world, but I don't know what to do. In our last reading, we saw how the soul of Hans Burgner, for the first time in his awareness, came to a point where he felt compassion. And he said he put the needs of his mother and his father above his own. And so he came to a point where he learned to love someone or something more than he loved himself. And that might just be an important realization to come to. Now, of course, in the song, they end with saying, I'd love to change the world, but I don't know what to do, so I'll leave it up to you. And let's hope that our protagonist won't leave it up to us, but will figure it out himself. So chapter 15, Homonculus. It would take too long to tell how I finally managed to gain a partial understanding of the symbolic language of alchemy. I say partial solution because I was still far from deriving any benefit from it. Every time I thought I had found the solution, my experiments would end in lamentable fiascos. You can well imagine how dispirited I became when I sat down alone and unprepared to read Raymundus Lullus' description of the preparation of the philosopher's stone. You prepare the stone thus, Raymundus Lullus wrote. You cut the sap of moon grass and extract its essence over a small, gentle fire. Then you will have what we call a quicksilver in the form of a white liquid, which is for washing and purifying the whole nature of our stone. This is one of the most important secrets. It is the first gate. The great dragon must be cleansed in this liquid and cast out of the Arabian desert. It would drown in the great sea. Turn it around and send it back to its birthplace in Ethiopia. We say that if it is not sent back and replaced on its own soil, it will depart for another region. And you should know that every other region and climate will certainly kill our stone to hide it from those who are ignorant and incompetent. Then another alchemist, Basilius Valentinus, speaks of driving the red lion through the gray wolf 3 times. The thing was made harder by the fact that each great alchemist used different animal and natural names to symbolize the various chemical substances and processes. They also had 100 different names for the prima materia. For example, Leo viridis, Veninum, Nutrix, Chaos, Azoth, Draco devorans caudam suam, and even Mercurius philosophorum. I found the most lucid references in the writing of Cornelius Agrippa von Nettesheim. My first step was to make up a dictionary of chemical substances and processes and put down beside them the cover names used by the various masters. Thus I learned what was meant by incineration, putrefaction, corruptio, ablification, and resurrection. But I still could not find the base of the prima materia. How many years I chased the phantom of the prima materia. How many different places I looked for it, in blood, fire, water, semen, excrement, and air. Then, when Homonculus finally helped me find the terrifyingly simple solution, my insane joy was tragically premature. Terra Virginea, that was another name for the prima materia. I freely admit I would never have found it without the aid of Homonculus, but it is discouraging to try to talk about him. That was one of the craziest adventures of my life. How can I possibly describe this pitiable, horrible phantom who inspired the mad experiments of obsessed alchemists and burdened the sleep of many more? It was the demon Homonculus who squatted behind all the infamous medieval experiments with artificial people. He was trying to get a body for himself, since the laws of the universe denied him legitimate birth. But even his best mediums could contact him only through the wall, that is, through the overhearing of uncertain dreams. None of them could see him, and he made no alliances with anyone except me. This unfortunate creature had been searching for millennia until he finally found me, another prisoner whom he could contact directly and use. For Homonculus' situation was like mine, only much worse. I was merely a captive in the physical and astral realms, where the whirling eruptions of emotion rolled and swept me through alternations of life and death toward the calmer waters of consequences. He was frozen in the barren, sterile intellect beyond the astral plane and this side of the mental, mid-realm of outer darkness. He couldn't connect anywhere, for he was as dry and unemotional as an empty sophism. He was never attracted by lust and never moved by temper. The astral vortex repelled him as a too complex force field with alien vibrations, and the majestic abstraction of the mental plane could not accept him. This plane could not accept him because he was a mass of theoretical dead letters that were jumbled, undigested, and frozen by the chill of his total separation. He was literally the nihil, living in no man's land between existence and latency. Once he had been a human being during the peak period of the ancient magical civilization. He created a masterpiece, an apparently irrefutable theory that denied the existence of his own soul. Thus he closed the third eye, spiritual sight, from the world of men. To replace this seeing eye, man developed the central brain, which acts like the groping fingers of the blind. Man could not see the truth promptly and tangibly anymore. He had to grope after it piece by piece, working from cause and effect. Homonculus celebrated his dark deed by constructing a labyrinthine ghost castle where the corridors led the wandering soul to the coffin from which there is no resurrection. The magical civilization declined and was destroyed by cataclysms, and the beings who were a part of it went to live on planets with denser physical atmospheres. But Homonculus, who had trapped so many souls like birds in his mental snare, was damned to remain in the fiction of death. Now it was his monomania to deny life and all that was a part of it. He dissected and trampled all concepts of heat, light, motion, and faith, but could provide himself no support or refuge to take their place. By persisting in this beyond conceivable limits, he killed his internal physical and astral planes. For if the slightest trace of these two lower planes had remained in him, he would have sunk to the lowest physical level and become a rock. But now he lingered like a tangled, rusty bed frame of intellect from which the cover and stuffing had fallen away. He had no fluids or intense forces, none of the passions or sufferings of the two planes. Thus he became an outcast, perpetually haunting the closed gate of spiritual resurrection. During one of our strange and disquieting sessions, I managed to get him to explain how he came to abandon the artificial human body fiasco and realize that simultaneous transmutation on all three levels was his only hope of liberation. Obviously, he had discovered something else too. Only a human being can perform that experiment. Never Homonculus, the paralyzed phantom. My solitary contemplations and my single lamp in the dusty alchemical workshop were what attracted the eternally alert, damned entity. He watched me for a long time before he ever tried to reach me. I still remember the shattering experience that was our first meeting. I had just arrived at another impasse after several months of hard work. I had been experimenting with blood, which involved my overcoming my horror of it and sustaining increased attacks from my demons. The passionate legions were strengthened and intoxicated by the smell. But though I had filtered, heated, condensed, thinned, frozen, dried, and evaporated blood, all I had gained was an increase in their attacks. I was completely exhausted and hollow with the emptiness of failure. Already, I was beyond rebellion and despair. I was lethargic. I had just cleaned the bloody test tubes because the activity gave me a few moments' peace from the astral wolves. They usually quieted down somewhat in the bleak night atmosphere of the forbidding room, just like carnival drunks do on Ash Wednesday. Now I felt sick and began to notice my aching back and burning eyes, to which I had been oblivious while I was working. Misery literally overpowered me. I was cold. I didn't have enough blood to warm me because I had used my own for my experiments. My abject condition was ideal for Homonculus. It enabled him to throw the first rope of the bridge he wanted to build between us. It might have been an hour past midnight. The first thing I noticed was the dimming of my lamp. I thought it had merely run out of oil or that the wick was sooty and adjusted it automatically. There was no real reason for me to be staying up. I just didn't feel strong enough to walk to my bed. I just sat there with my aching back bent over my scattered notes. Despite my open eyes and discomfort, I fell into the sort of half-trance in which the soul wanders defenselessly in the dark. The lamp darkened again. This prompted a few stray thoughts. I had just filled it, and I cut and pulled up the wick, but still the light was smothered by the damp cold. Now the flame narrowed, sputtered, and smoked. Slowly I realized it was not casting its light in a normal circle. The light stretched to the left corner of the wall and seemed to wash it away into infinity. And at the end of the yellow beam, magnified in horrifying immensity, something was waiting, or someone. It is almost impossible to describe the outer form of Homonculus as I saw him that night. His existence is a negative one. His form, the color and substance of extinct cosmic nebulae, is so black that no outline can be discerned, and yet I saw menacing chasms and hell-bound tunnels within him. His blackness was of many shades, but he was easily distinguishable from ordinary darkness. Homonculus stood there, an enormous Chinese ink shadow beyond the material and astral forms. He looked like a bizarre cave entrance painted by a Chinese artist, except that his outline was constantly changing. Peaks, hooks, and tentacles would shoot out from him at unnerving, unexpected points. The figure would elongate and then crash down to condense in a whirling spiral. This phenomenon was actually his thought forms, for he was possessed of motion like every other living being. I became dully absorbed in just watching him. Presently, I felt a pressure to listen to an alien voice that pounded in my brain. "Can you see me?" It was like a shout in an empty hall. The sound seemed to come from inside me, but I knew it was the voice of the titanic spirit I saw whirling in the distance. "Yes!" My raspy voice broke the spell. Suddenly my astral rabble screamed around me like frightened vultures. My heart pounded wildly and I broke out in a cold sweat. Somehow I managed to stumble to bed and bury myself, still fully clothed, under the covers. What had that presence been? I couldn't stop shaking. Homonculus' paralyzing shadow shook me more than anything else I had ever experienced. He was the very antithesis of light, while there is a spark in even the most horrible astral demon. Homonculus absorbed and annihilated light. He was darkness itself, the devil. It was weeks before Homonculus managed to contact me again. His desire for contact weighed continuously on me in the meantime, howling through me like a ghastly autumn draft. Whenever I was scared or tired, I was especially conscious of his efforts. Then I was almost grateful for my astral whirlpool. It shielded me from him like a hellish armor. Now it was December, with colorless days that swiftly gave way to long, gloomy nights. The very walls radiated winter. A pan of embers hardly warmed more than 3 feet of floor area. Winds blew through the corridors, wailed in the chimney, and cut into my bones. Presently, I took to my bed with a severe cold. I was ravaged by fevers, but my temperature fell at last. My body, cooled and weakened by profuse sweating, was again in a condition in which Homonculus could appear. And there he was again, as always at the end of a long beam of light. His deep, sepulchral voice reverberated in my brain. "Can you see me?" "Yes." This time I answered with a silent, shivering thought. "What do you want?" "To ally myself with you." Fierce protests rushed into my brain from my every reason and instinct. Homonculus' imperious voice calmly broke through the raging flood. "Think a minute, you fool. Do you think you'll ever find the prima materia messing around with blood and excrement? You'll never find it by yourself, only with the aid of Homonculus." That established the bridge between us. My entire being had been long concentrated on the prima materia, and everything else had been secondary. I ignored the warning signals of my senses and reason. The magic words glowed between us. The prima materia. This was the first step, the foundation of the cosmic temple of transmutation, the cradle of the great magisterium, the holy and ancient mother womb where I could find liberation. Now it was my own excitement that disrupted the connection. How hard I tried to get back in touch with that powerful entity of wide horizons who knew, while I had to grope like other human worms. He wanted to help me. He offered to ally himself with me, had chosen me for the purpose. Did he demand a price? No matter, I would gladly pay. But the more I wanted another meeting, the farther I was from achieving it. I began to realize that Homonculus required a peculiar condition of physical and emotional repose to make contact. I attempted to induce the half-trance that had led to our first meeting, but my disturbed thoughts and their hysterical companions barred my way. Only for a few seconds could I create an empty space within myself. Finally, after making strenuous efforts, I succeeded in getting a glimpse of him again and compiling from the fragmented words I could gather a method of establishing a permanent connection. I had to learn a special breathing exercise and a sitting position. Later on, I used a special incense prepared to his recipe. Even so, it was almost a year before we established permanent contact. The silent, candle-lit night hours were best for us, and these infernal seances produced a strange ferment in my intellect that drove me out of my peaceful harbor. Homonculus acted on my intellect rather as a grinding wheel does on a knife. He taught me the abstract speculation that dissects everything layer by layer. I also learned the spell of destructive questions that kill every concept without arriving at any positive conclusion. For Homonculus did not bother to deny God, he simply proved that he couldn't exist. In the same way he proved that eternal life is a fiction. His chain of syllogisms was unassailable and would have been impressive if he himself had not been living without a body for thousands of years. Living in the cul-de-sac of a perfectly constructed theory that was refuted only by reality. We had some immensely strange debates, but they never lasted long. He would crush my arguments with his powerful, grinding logic, just as a hungry lion crushes a mouse that has got into his cage by accident. I had always thought that vanity was a hot emotion that whips and kills, but in Homonculus I found it in a vastly different form, a sort of magic, mummified vanity that had been embalmed for thousands of years. This dried-up spectre of emotion hounded his tragic intellect. This thought monster had the compulsion to manifest himself and appear before men with all his frightening accomplishments. Homonculus wouldn't tolerate having his work attributed to me. He demanded that I declare him, otherwise I would never have uttered a word about his presence. I was surprised at his sinister gloating over the enthrallment and astonishment we produced in human jackasses. "I despise them," he told me, "but their admiration is my due, just as tax is a king's, except, of course, that the difference between ruler and subject is minuscule compared to that between myself and them." His theory was that the universe is just a stupid, sluggish, mortal body with a brain that is as unconscious of the suffering of its cells as that of any human jackass. The only difference is that its life cannot be measured in human time. This ignorant, blind titan must be killed, he said, so that the suffering corpuscles could be freed to fall back into the peace of eternal nothingness. And he, Homonculus, was to be the liberator, the savior of eternal death. The murderous dagger was to be his implement of transmutation. A white magician, he explained, possessing the great magisterium, builds up the life of the organism by becoming a finer cell, a brain cell which he nurtures to the status of God and manifests through himself. Then the power of Homonculus can open the main artery he has enlarged, and the blood of this cruel and senseless macrocosms will be drained. The Titan will die, motion will cease, matter will be dissolved and annihilated, and with it will go the materia and the essence of an invisible substance, the fiction of the human soul. No one knew the makeup of matter better than Homonculus. He was like a surgeon, except that the matter he reduced to its basic components was infinitely more subtle. He knew the secrets of the function of that chemical laboratory, the human body, from the glands to the circulation of the blood, from the genes to the mechanism of the astral body. He taught me things in 1633 that contemporary medical science knew nothing about. When he had discovered that he had to transmute himself on all three levels to be liberated, he began his Sisyphean experiments with artificial human bodies, influencing alchemists to work for him. According to him, these experiments failed because of contaminated, low-grade brain filters that distorted his instructions. He finally discarded the idea altogether because he saw an easier solution by using me. My constitution could experiment on all three levels. He had only to use his own genius to get through the gate to the other world I had pried open by my mystical transgression. We were perfectly united now, having established a permanent and direct connection. Now Homonculus decided he had to repolish me before we could begin. He had to establish order in my mind and clean out muddy concepts, to hone my reasoning ability like the finest of blades. This was the purpose of our debates. He did thorough work, and it began to affect my everyday life. His implanted skepticism destroyed the metaphysical conglomeration of emotions built by my experience and made me arrogant, impatient, and provoking. Obviously, I couldn't tolerate Maria Dora's pious dogmatism anymore. I had to argue with her and mock her. Fra Niccolò, that obtuse and timid little priest, became frightened of me, though all my questions about God, creation, Sin, free will, and the fall of man were just feeble echoes of those of Homonculus. Still, they made him break out in a sweat, and after stammering pitiably, he would cry, "Apage Satanas," and cross himself fearfully. These same questions came up again during the period of anti-religious materialism in the 19th century, and the people who raised them believed, even as I had, that they had finally chopped off all the heads of the hydra of metaphysical lies. Of course, I wasn't behaving very prudently, but I was overcome by the fervor of my new convictions. This sort of thing happens even now to a person suddenly converted to new beliefs. Today we realize that atheism and materialism are just as passionate and dogmatic as their opposites. My transformation made old Maria Dora almost physically ill. When Fra Nicolo told her he wouldn't teach me any longer for anything under the sun, she cried and begged me to come to my senses before I endangered not only my soul's salvation but my health. Already the city was alive with rumors that I had sold my soul to the devil and that my dead mother was really a witch who had arranged the transaction. Obviously, such a contract would involve my taking a stand against the church and disturbing the pious flock as much as possible to divert the lambs from the righteous path. My satanic, cunning questions were obvious proof that this was my intention. If they had not been spawned in hell, an honest religious man could have answered them. Only the devil spun such snares for God's gullible doves. I knew that most of this insidious gossip was coming from the monastery of San Marco, and that it meant grave danger. I would have been glad enough to leave, but Homonculus wanted me to stay a little longer and complete my studies. I would have to leave before too much longer in any case, because my father's workshop was not properly equipped for the great experiment. Money and patronage would be no problem. Homonculus knew the levers that would move human stupidity and gullibility. As it happened, I had to leave, sooner than Homonculus wanted me to. Maria Dora's loving concern brought on the catastrophe, as was often the case when she tried to help people. Not even Fra Nicolo's hurt piety and pride spread the news of my godlessness faster than she, as she told her tale to woe to old women, nuns, and horrified priests. We didn't have to wait long for the results. The sentence was pronounced. The devil must be driven out of me. Now, exorcism is a great and solemn ceremony, and people crowd around with holy fear and curiosity as the divine expert swings his censer, sprinkles holy water, and uses the flaming sword of sacred words against the evil one. But my devil wouldn't cooperate. It didn't scream when sprinkled with holy water, and the incense just made it sneeze. I found the whole spectacle both humorous and revolting. The women pressed together in religious horror, Maria Dora red with weeping, Fra Nicolo's gloomy monkey face, and the dirty little kid who had gotten in somehow and picked his nose through the whole affair. All these burst in on me in my peaceful workshop. They tore Trismosan's Aureum Velus from my hand, burned it, and threw water on it like it was a dead rat. Then they sprinkled me, but to no effect. My devil did not leave. In fact, he began to laugh and jest and have a high old time. He proceeded to argue more cunningly than ever and wound up by chasing the entire company out of the house. I was lucky to get away with simply being banished, and the only reason they contented themselves with that was the fact that I was long gone when they tried to catch up with me. I began to realize in those last hours just how strong were the ties I had to the lovely old house. Memories of my mother's gentle blue-clad figure followed me from room to room. Old whispers permeated the walls, and the furniture retained the curves of long-vanished forms. As I bade my macabre farewells, the past seemed to waver on the threshold of the present. I felt I had only to call and my father would come shuffling into the room. The blankets on the bed took form as though someone lay sleeping under them. I was again haunted by those screams and the smells of bloody birth and the frightful desolation that followed. My soul was filled with loneliness and tender mourning. The objects in the house reached out to me and spoke of the thoughts and feelings of many years. The great, dusty cypress outside spoke to me of unspeakable things. The black and white flagstones, the faded curtains, the time-stained pictures, the fragrance of the wardrobes and cabinets all hurt, each on its separate nerve end. I had not realized how attached to them I was. I left, hurriedly at dusk, with only a small package, pursued by Maria Dora's sobs and my own desolate feelings. For a long time, I didn't dare look back. I stared intently at the wet, withered leaves under my feet. A nervous October wind rippled the puddles formed by the afternoon rain. I thought about visiting my parents' graves, but decided against it immediately. Why should I? They weren't there. Empty shells crumbled within them, ruined castles just like that old house. It was Anno Domini 1636, and I was 20 years old. I stopped on the Viale dei Colli and looked back at the house. It lay with extinguished eyes under an overcast sky, deserted forever. I burst into tears. Suddenly, I was certain I was lost without my mother. We wandered over half of Europe in the years following my banishment. During this time we had many adventures, turbulent, amusing, and sad, but we accomplished very little useful work. However, since Homonculus was my accomplice, I gained considerable fame as an alchemist, sorcerer, and miracle doctor without suffering any evil consequences. Whenever a situation became perilous, Homonculus would tell me to leave and off I would go. Sometimes afoot, sometimes on horseback, and occasionally in a 4-horse carriage with finely trimmed horses. It all depended on who had been my latest victim or how generous my latest patron had been. Homonculus knew how to make gold, but he chose to make it wholly from human stupidity. My methods of convincing the most cynical doubters were not charlatanism. They were based on an exact recognition of the logic of events and a deep-seated knowledge of the relationships and laws of nature. Of course, it was Homonculus who knew these things, not I. He could predict weather changes, floods, earthquakes, and even political tensions and wars, and he made me use these predictions as threats. Plagues and animal diseases always happened just as he had said, and he was always right about the point at which any disease turned for the better or the worse. His diagnoses were infallible, and he was never wrong about the hour of death. As I have said, he was proud of his abilities in a dry and ghostly way, but he would never let me spread myths about him. "This is just acquired knowledge deduced from observations through thousands of years," he said. "I have been able to pry out even the most hidden characteristics of matter, and I didn't begin as a specialist. I started from the synthesis of the macrocosms as an integral whole. For instance, I know how tiny cells on Earth will react to spots on the sun. I also know, like any physician worth his salt, that kidney malfunction will cause the legs to swell." Homonculus was completely right about everything that related to the physical world and its component parts, even down to their most complex functions. Yet, he erred gravely and fundamentally about the essence of these things. It was for naught that his calculations were exact and unassailable. His mathematics might be perfect, but the mystical life eluded him. But more of this later.